This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Romulo Lollato, K-State wheat production specialist, begins today's show with a Day 2 update from the 2023 Hard Winter Wheat Tour of Kansas. He says they saw more abandoned fields and calculated a lower yield on the route. The show continues with Jeff Whitworth, Extension Field crop entomologist, with an update on Army Cutworms, Army Worms, and Alfalfa Weevils. Certain insects are more of a nuisance, while others can cause damage to crops. Rebecca McMahon, administrator of K-State's Local Food Systems Program, ends today's show and says all gardeners will find valuable information on planting, growing, and harvesting a variety of fruits and vegetables in Kansas's difficult climate. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. We start Thursday's programming for Agriculture Today with a Day 2 update from the Kansas Wheat Tour taking place. And for that update, we're once again joined by Kansas Wheat Production Specialist, Romulo Lollato. Romulo, yesterday you did some more traveling, going from western, central, and southern Kansas, and touched a bit on the northern counties there in Oklahoma. But with those 276 stops, kind of the same story from yesterday. Could you tell us a bit about it?
Yes, absolutely. So in this second day of the Wheat Quality Tour, we leave there from Colby early in the morning, and essentially all of those 6 routes go south towards the southwest corner of the state, covering different parts, right? Some of them are in the central portion, some of them are towards the western portion and bordering Colorado there. And then we turn east and go finish the day towards Wichita. So that's kind of the area that we covered. It's usually some pretty long mileage. There's even a route that goes through Oklahoma there. So that's the area that we covered yesterday. In terms of what we were seeing, right, and I will just remind the listeners that that's the area that we were expecting to see the worst wheat and the largest area abandonment in the state, right? And this is like prior to going to the actual tree. And indeed, as we left Colby and we started moving south around Colby, things were still looking pretty good because they had some more snowfall and there was actually some moisture in the ground from some rainfall that they had just had that morning. But as we headed south, things started to get progressively worse. There was a spot around the Garden City area that seems like they got some rainfall there as well because the crop was not too terrible there. But talking to some growers in that stretch between Colby and Garden City there, they were reporting anywhere from 25% of the area has already been abandoned, up to 90% of the area has already been abandoned. So a very, very large percent of area abandonment in that region, especially as we move south. As we move towards the Garden City piece, again, there was kind of like a good spot around that Garden City, which I think has probably gotten some rainfall there, and we were getting some yield estimates there on the 35 bushel range. So again, good for the year that we're having, right? And not historically, if we think of a 35 bushel crop, we're usually not very happy with that. But this year we are. The majority of the fields that we're seeing in that stretch, they were either, again, had already been sprayed, or they were in really, really tough conditions, showing yield potential there we measured as low as 9 bushels per acre up until about 20, 25 or so. So very rough conditions in the western part of the state. As we moved from that southwest corner towards the more south-central corner of the state, going towards Wichita, I was aware that the crop in that region was already going through some pretty tough conditions as well, that south-central region, Harbor County, Pratt County, Stafford, and so on. But it is really bad. I mean, that's one part of the state where we usually have, in this tour, we're sampling yields on that 50, 60 bushel range, and it's a good yielding region within the state. But this year, the conditions have been so rough out there, and the soils in that region, they don't hold nearly as much water as the soils in the western part of the state does. The crop there is suffering really, really bad. So we're doing yield estimates there again on that, anywhere from that 8 bushel per acre range until some of the good fields there were reaching 35 or 40s, but very rare and far between. We were seeing many fields that got hail damage. So actually from that Roselle to Great Bend region, so from Larne to Great Bend, roughly there, a very large stretch where every single field, both sides of the road, has been damaged by hail. That we see many broken plants, many plants with white heads, just an overall field that probably not going to get harvested and has already probably been adjusted there. So that hail damage ranging from completely terminating a field to probably, anywhere, any type of damage that you can imagine. But there is a pretty large stretch there where many fields have just been terminated by that hail damage. In terms of things that we're seeing consistently in the tour, it seems like we're seeing more and more appearance of white heads. Those white heads, at this point in time, they can have many different causes. One of them that we're seeing consistently in the south-central region of the state, more so than in north-central, was freeze damage. So probably from that Salina region and south in this trip, we saw quite a bit of freeze damage, but especially in the south-central part of the state. That was quite variable. Many of the fields were just like the top third of the head was pretty much gone due to that freeze damage, but it could be more variable as well depending on the crop development. So that freeze damage that we had, so this cold spell would have been about 2 to 3 weeks ago. Really, I think it's going to take a toll in our yield as well, Shelby. Even though we haven't talked about it as much as we have talked about the drought, definitely will have an impact on our yields. We're also seeing some white heads that are due to wheat stem maggot, right? And those are fairly common across the state, and we kind of expect them at this time of the year as well. But again, the big stories so far were the widespread drought, which again was very, very devastating in the western third of the state, but it really expanded very far east into south-central Kansas. Then followed by that would be the freeze damage, right? And then some of these other things that we're seeing here and there with hail damage, which was bad, but a little bit more concentrated, and some other general damage that we're seeing across the crop as well.
And Romulo, yesterday we mentioned one positive that had come from the tour was there wasn't really any disease. However, this time around for day 2, you did see a little bit of wheat streak mosaic virus.
Yeah, we were seeing every now and then in fields that we were stopping, right? There was signs of the wheat streak mosaic virus. We have had some epidemic years of wheat streak mosaic virus in the past where we would drive 40, 50, 60 miles and the crop was yellow and stunted and short on both sides of the road. This year, what we're seeing, it doesn't really compare to that, right? So those epidemic years that we have seen in the past, it's not what we're seeing this year. But it is out there. We're seeing some scattered cases of wheat streak mosaic virus here and there. And in those fields that got affected, yields will be damaged by that. And again, to different extents, right? But I guess even though we were seeing these in more consistently than we were seeing that in the first day, I believe in the first day we only got into one field that I remember having some symptoms of wheat streak mosaic virus. And yesterday it was more frequent than that. But it's not an epidemic as we have seen in past years, right? So, for example, it was 2018 where we saw a really bad epidemic in western part of the state. And this just very last immediate year here, 2022, where south central part of the state was quite affected by wheat streak mosaic. Again, so this year we were seeing some of it, but I don't think that it was anywhere near what we have had in the past. One thing that I will note is that the routes that went far south, like the routes that went through Oklahoma or the route that went through southern tier of counties of Kansas, they were reporting an immense amount of crop abandonment. So they were reporting, we only did 6 to 8 stops when the normal is doing 14, 15, 16 stops. We only did 6 to 8 stops because there's really no wheat to see. So they were mentioning that a lot of the crop has already been abandoned or grazed out. So there were very few in between fields of wheat that were just left to sample. And it's important to mention as well, Shelby, that the yield estimate that came out yesterday, which is just north of about 27 bushels per acre or so, it would be representative of the fields that are remaining. So a lot of the Kansas wheat crop will be abandoned. I know that the USDA last estimate was less than 20%, but I would not be surprised if we see historical high values there towards north of 20, 25%. So a lot of the wheat area being abandoned, whatever is left is that yield that we're coming out of. So we're not including in that yield estimate any of those abandoned fields that are yielding 0 or so, or 5. Anything below 5 bushels per acre is really not being added into those averages.
And so, Romulo, you mentioned that the yield was about 27.5 yesterday, and the day before that it was 29.8. And so it was down from what you saw on day one. But as you finished this last little bit, could you quickly tell us kind of what you're expecting to see from Wichita to Manhattan?
Yeah, in this last little stretch here of the trip, usually, well, at least I would expect this year to be in a little bit better shape on what we've seen this far. Like most of the samples now, they'd be around that I-35 or east of I-35. And so, again, in that case, we will be having more rainfall, right? Those counties didn't get as affected by water stress as some of the counties in western Kansas. So I would expect us to see a little bit better wheat going back home there, going back to Manhattan. But even though it would be a slightly better yield estimates there, that's a fairly small amount of wheat that is planted in that area. So probably not as representative. So maybe we may end up the day today with day average of 30 or 35 for the day. But again, that shouldn't impact much the calculations because it's a fairly small area that will be under these conditions. So I think that the start of this wheat crop, again, is very widespread drought with extra cherries on the cake there on freeze damage and hail damage and some wheat streak mosaic here and there. So really not a beautiful thing or really not a good crop season for wheat in Kansas this year. But we'll take what we get and we'll hope for a better season next year. Hopefully as conditions turn into El Nino here, we may be complaining about excessive moisture this time next year. That would be good for a change.
Romulo, thank you for joining us and giving us an update on day 2 from the wheat tour. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Shelby. I appreciate it.
That was K-State Wheat Production Specialist Romulo Lollato. If you would like to find out the information that is concluded from this complete wheat tour, you can find that information at kswheat.com, which we will link in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break, but we'll be back with more. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and now we're going to talk about armyworms, alfalfa weevils, and Army cutworms. And to do that is Extension Field crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth. Jeff, thanks for joining us today.
Hey, my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
To get started, do you want to talk about Army cutworms?
Army cutworms are one of my favorite insects just because of their uniqueness. The Army cutworm, there's been a lot of talk about them lately just because the moths can be a really nuisance around houses. Anytime you have a light on, the moths gather, and they're just now becoming, well, in the last week or two, they've been becoming adults. Just a brief review of the Army cutworm biology. The Army cutworm is a moth. The moth right now is gathering, and generally in Kansas it's right about, I always figure over Memorial Weekend is when most of the moths get together and head to the Rocky Mountains for oversummering. They always go over there, and really over the years I've kind of tracked it, and it's just about Memorial Weekend. This year it's a week or two early, but still we've had a lot of hot weather, a little bit unusual, so it's speeded them up a little bit. But they're still gathering together in the last week or two, causing a lot of concern from folks just because of their nuisance, but they'll soon be gone and head to the Rockies. They spend the summer under rocks and logs and tree bark and all kinds of places in the mountains. And then next fall, they start to trek back. In September, October, they come back and lay eggs all the way from the Rockies. In Kansas, they get about to 77 Highway, which goes north and south out of Junction City. East of there, they don't make it that far, but they will lay eggs, and every year is a little bit different. But this year we've had quite a few. In the last 2 to 3 years, we've had quite a few problems with Army cutworms. They lay eggs in the fall in the wheat and the alfalfa because those are the only 2 crops that are green at that time of year. And then they can lay eggs in yards, but mostly it's alfalfa and wheat at that time of year. The moths don't hurt anything other than they're a nuisance. They're very quick. They fly up. They hide in your windowsill or your doorsill because they were attracted to the lights that you had on last night. Then you open the door and they all fly in the house. So they're just really more of a nuisance, but they're really kind of a neat insect because they head out. The difference between an armyworm and an Army cutworm, and we'll talk about armyworms in just a minute. The Army cutworm, remember I said the moths come back in the fall and they lay eggs. and those eggs will hatch in the fall, and then those larvae, the cutworms, will feed all winter anytime the temperature's over 45, 48 degrees. So they're feeding in the winter, and that's why they pupate and become a moth in the spring, right around Memorial Weekend. The army worm, which we've been getting calls about and getting pictures on, is also a moth, but the army worm is just now laying eggs in the spring. And I've probably gotten more pictures and calls about army worms this year than I have in the last 10 years. Now, the thing that's worrisome about that is, remember 2 or 3 years ago, army worms and fall army worms were a real problem in yards and any sorghum, corn, grass crop, because that's what they feed on. They prefer grasses. They can be a real problem in pastures. In brome pastures, we've had a real problem with them the last 2 or 3 years. The moths are now laying eggs. They have been for the last couple of weeks. Those eggs will hatch. The thing that's concerning about that, we've had more moths than we normally do at this time of the year. This is the first generation, to start the first generation. So generally that's a springboard generation. We generally don't see very many this time of year. And then another month, 30 to 45 days, you'll see another flush of moths as they become adults. And that's when we usually start getting calls about the larvae doing damage on a grass crop. They can actually feed on wheat if there's any wheat around then, or brome pastures, yards, sorghum, corn. Those are both grasses. Just depends on where the crop is and the stage of development when the larvae come out. And then there can even be another generation, and that generally comes about, the second or the third generation comes about in maybe August, and that can be pretty devastating also, depending upon how many there are at the time. So the army worms, the moths that are out there right now, that's just, they're laying eggs, and there should be some small larvae, and this is the springboard generation, so I'm just advising everybody to keep their eyes open for young larvae in any grass, in your yard, in your wheat, early planted corn, sorghum, whatever, because right now there's more moths around, more adults around, which means that has the potential to lay eggs than we normally see at this time of year. So the difference between army cutworm and an army worm is the army cutworm is not going to feed on any crops now. The adults are all headed into Colorado over summer in the mountains. The army worm moth is out laying eggs. Those eggs will hatch, and the larvae will feed on a grass, preferably. Now, I say that because they prefer that. If they can't find a grass and there's soybeans around, they will feed on soybeans, but they prefer, a grass to feed on. So those are just getting started.
So taking a quick step back to the army cutworms, also sometimes referred to as the miller moth, not really a big concern for producers, but maybe just an annoyance in your household or in your sheds.
Yes, exactly right. I don't know why they're called miller moths, but they have been ever since I was a kid. I've always heard them called, I got these millers are terrible, or miller moths. But they're very quick. They're very secretive. They hide, so if you leave the crack of your window and your door down, they'll get in there overnight. You open the door and there's a bunch of them. They're very quick. But the moth itself is just a nuisance.
Now, maybe not so much of just a nuisance, but maybe sometimes more of a problem, alfalfa weevils.
Alfalfa weevils have been a serious problem. They're our number one pest in alfalfa year after year. It's not even close. They're considered a severe pest, and that means, generally speaking, you have to spray for them every year. Otherwise, you will donate a portion of your first cutting to the alfalfa weevil. And even if you spray, a lot of times you have to donate. This year, the alfalfa weevils, right now, they're just also becoming adults or just finishing up, but there's still considerable concern about the larvae. Most growers have sprayed once or twice now, and the questions I'm getting, should I spray a third time? Generally, the treatment threshold for alfalfa weevils is 30 to 50%. What that means is if you have, 1 per 3 stems infested or 1 per 2 stems infested, you probably should treat again, even though you've treated 2 or 3 times. You got to remember, weather allows insects, it controls their development 100%. This year we saw an early flush of egg hatching, so we had a lot of larvae probably a month ago or 6 weeks ago, and then it got cold, so that kind of slowed it down, and then it warmed up again, and we saw another flush of eggs. So a lot of growers had to spray 2 times, and now they're wondering about spraying a 3rd time. Right now, from what I've seen in the last couple of days, most of the alfalfa weevils are in the adult stage. Adults will over summer someplace other than in the alfalfa field. Now, I say that they may get down in the leaf litter in the alfalfa in the bottom of the canopy, but for the most part, they leave the alfalfa field and they go to someplace where it's shady and cooler. They're a cool weather insect, and the adults won't stay in the field. But that being said, right now, there are still a lot of adults in the field. If it rains where you can't get in and swath your alfalfa, that leaves a nice canopy where it's nice and shady. So the adults will hang out in the alfalfa field until it's cut. And in so doing, they can feed a little bit on the leaves. They can also feed on the stems. And the feeding on the stems leaves a very characteristic look we call barking of the stems. But the adult feeding is not nearly as voracious as the larvae. So the adults, even though they feed a little bit, most of the damage they do is cosmetic. It mostly is just concern because you go out and you can see the adults. They're right up there on top of the alfalfa plants, and they're very active and mobile. So you can see them. So a lot of growers get concerned, but they really don't do that much damage. The thing is, they're very difficult to control also. And we don't have a treatment threshold for adults. We have treatment thresholds for the larvae, but not for adults, because we just don't recommend treating for adults. I recommend if you are within 7 to 10 days of swathing or cutting your field, cut it. Don't spray it. If you do spray, you got to pay attention to the pre-harvest interval for whatever product you use. So make sure you do. But really and truly, if you just let it go, once we get some weather over 85, 90 degrees, the adults should take off and leave and not come back till fall. And even if they're there, they're not going to do that much damage. Like I said, it's mostly just cosmetic or concerning. It's not going to really impact yield that much.
And so you mentioned quite a few different crop insects here. If people are seeing something in their crops, how can they find out what that insect is?
Well, the best thing to do is call your county extension agent first. That's our first line of identification and knowledge, really. They have access to all of our extension publications, or you can go online and download all of our extension publications for free, or you can get a hold of your consultants or call me, write me, whatever, Jeff Whitworth at K-State. We'll be happy to help you. But the first line of help is the county extension office in the town nearest you.
Jeff, thank you for coming in today and kind of giving us an update on different insects that are in fields and what producers could be doing. That was Extension Field Crop Entomologist Jeff Whitworth with an update on what crop insects are currently doing in Kansas and what producers could be expecting.
This is Agriculture Today. I'm Jeff Wickman. After undergoing an update and revision, the new Kansas Garden Guide is available in print and as an online resource. Rebecca McMahon, administrator of Kansas State University's Local Food Systems Program and one of the guide's authors, says the layout walks gardeners through the entire process and the challenges of gardening in Kansas.
You start at the beginning of the book at the first chapter, and you're going to talk about starting and planting a garden. And we talk about the soil and composting, different types of gardening methods. Kind of follow the season along. We're going to get to our pest management challenges, insects and diseases, and beneficial insects. And then we get to the harvesting and storage and food safety topics. Overall, it does kind of follow you through the whole season. And then kind of the second half of the book is more what I would consider a reference section where you can go more in depth on specific vegetables or look for different sorts of...
I even wrote down that it goes from asparagus to watermelon and everything in between.
Yes. The vegetable crops chapter, which is chapter 15, is really about half of the book, and it does, like you said, literally go from asparagus all the way to watermelon. If you're wondering why not zucchini, it's because zucchini is lumped in with summer squashes and pumpkins and stuff like that. But yes, hopefully almost anything you want to grow you can find in there, or at least enough information to get you started. We tried to include vegetables and information that can help you figure out what direction you want to go. Whether you're wanting to grow a very traditional American orange-fleshed cantaloupe, or if you're wanting to grow, a much less common Korean white-fleshed melon. Hopefully you'll be able to find what you need to get yourself started.
Well, and the fact that you have so much information on when to start planting, when to do the harvesting, or at least approximations of when that might be occurring.
Yes. So I grew up in northern Wisconsin, and the weather is very different, and the gardening season is very different. And then I've lived in other places and gardened in other places, and then moving to Kansas and being here for 15 years, I've really had to learn and appreciate that with the Kansas climate, we have to be on point about when to plant, when to harvest, and everything in between. Because if we're not on top of our schedule and our planting plan and knowing the right time to plant things and when not to plant certain things, we're not going to have near the success. And it's so critical to know what to plant and when to plant it here in Kansas, because the weather is going to fight back.
This really is a way to not only get started with gardening, but if you're even a more advanced gardener, this is not only informational, but it's really educational as well.
I hope that even an experienced gardener can take this guide and find something new or inspirational in it. One of the things that I've learned is that we're always learning more. We're always learning new things about how plants grow and how to accommodate the challenges of our Kansas climate. One of the things that I think agriculture has learned a lot over the last 10 to 20 years is the importance of organic matter and soil biology. We had a good understanding of soil chemistry and fertility, and I think there's increasingly that understanding of the importance of the soil biology, of having live plants, of having cover crops, of keeping the soil covered to prevent erosion and maintain nutrient levels and maintain soil biology. We're always learning something new. And sometimes we think we understand something and then we learn something new and then we learn something new again. So I hope that even an experienced gardener can take the guide and find some new ideas or new ways of thinking about gardening, or maybe some new vegetables or herbs that they might like to try.
That's Rebecca McMahon, administrator of Kansas State University's Local Food Systems Program and an author of the revised Kansas Garden Guide, which is available through the K-State Research and Extension Bookstore. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Whitworth. This is the K-State Radio Network.